When the Iron Queen went blind in her 80th floor office, she didn't call for help. Instead, her only lifeline became a ghost in a blue jumpsuit, the very man she was scheduled to fire the next morning. The executive floor of the Vance Tower was a cathedral of glass. Chrome and silence, a silence that Elena Vance curated as carefully as her billion-dollar portfolio. At 42, Elena had earned the nickname the Executioner in Kashmir. Not through cruelty for its own sake, but through a surgical, icy efficiency that viewed human sentiment as a luxury her balance sheets couldn't afford. On this Tuesday evening, the city of Chicago stretched out beneath her like a grid of glowing embers. But Elena wasn't looking at the view. Her focus was narrowed to a single manila folder resting on her mahogany desk. Inside was the death warrant for the Greenfield factory, a sprawling manufacturing plant on the city's south side that had been the heartbeat of its neighborhood for 60 years. To the 300 families who relied on it, it was a lifeline. To Elena, it was a legacy. Drain, an underperforming asset that occupied land far more valuable as a future site for luxury condominiums and tech hubs. She tapped her fountain pen against the desk. The rhythmic click-clack, the only sound in the room. Her head throbbed with a persistent, dull ICA byproduct of 15-hour workdays, and a refusal to acknowledge the blurring at the edges of her vision, dismissed the physical protest as mere exhaustion. In her world, weakness was an invitation for the board of directors to circle like sharks. And Elena Vance did not bleed. 30 floors below, David Thorne began his shift with the heavy, rhythmic grace of a man who had long ago accepted his place in the machinery of the world. At 34, David's life was a delicate bridge built of overtime hours and skipped meals, all designed to keep his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, safe. While Elena analyzed global markets, David analyzed the scuff marks on marble tiles and the stubborn coffee rings left behind by distracted VPs. He wore his blue industrial jumpsuit like a suit of armor, though the fabric was thinning at the elbows and knees. David was a ghost in the tower. He moved through the hallways after the important people had gone home, cleaning up the physical debris of their ambition. He was one of the men on the Greenfield factory roster, a second-generation floor worker who took the night janitorial gig at headquarters just to make ends meet after the factory hours were slashed. He knew the rumors. He knew the executioner upstairs was holding a pen that could effectively erase his neighborhood. Every time he passed the elevator bank leading to the 80th floor, he felt a flare of resentment. Yet he kept his head down. He couldn't afford the luxury of pride. He had a daughter with a congenital heart murmur and a mountain of medical bills that required the very insurance Elena Vance was planning to terminate. The clock struck 9 p.m. and the tower felt hollow. A shell of corporate intent. Elena remained in her office, her eyes straining against the harsh glow of her triple monitor setup. The headache had evolved from a dull throb into a pulsing white-hot needle behind her retinas. She rubbed her temples, trying to focus on the projected earnings of the Vance Heights development. But the numbers began to swim, drifting off the screen like dark ink dropped into water. She growled in frustration, a rare display of temper in the vacuum of her office. She stood up too quickly, the world tilting on its axis. For a terrifying second, the floor seemed to liquefy beneath her designer pumps. She gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white. "Just stress," she whispered to the empty room, her voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. She reached for her glass of water, but her hand overshot the mark, knocking the crystal tumbler to the floor. It shattered with a violent, musical crash that seemed far too loud for the quiet office. The sound of the breaking glass echoed down the hallway, reaching David as he emptied a recycling bin near the executive lounge. Usually, he followed a strict protocol. Never enter a private office if the occupant is still inside. But the crash was followed by a heavy thud and a silence that felt heavy with distress. David hesitated, his hand tightening on the handle of his rolling cart. He knew who was in that office. He knew that the woman behind those doors viewed him as little more than a sentient piece of cleaning equipment. Part of him wanted to turn the other way to let the Iron Queen deal with her own mess. But the memory of Lily's voice, always reminding him to help the broken things, tugged at his conscience. He took a breath, adjusted his name tag, and pushed his cart toward the corner office. When David stepped into the suite, he didn't see the formidable CEO who graced the covers of Forbes. He saw a woman slumped on the floor amidst a sea of shattered glass and scattered papers. Elena was hyperventilating, her hands clawing at the air as if trying to find a solid surface in a world that had suddenly vanished. The lights of the office were still at full brightness, but her pupils were blown wide, staring at nothing. "Ms. Vance?" David asked softly, keeping his distance so as not to startle her. Elena flinched at the sound of his voice, her head whipping toward him. "Who's there? Turn the lights on. Why is it so dark?" she demanded, her voice cracking with a vulnerability that would have shocked her competitors. David looked up at the ceiling. The LED panels were blindingly bright. A cold realization washed over him. She wasn't sitting in the dark. She was blind. He moved closer, his footsteps heavy and deliberate so she could track his movement. "It's David, ma'am, from the night crew. The lights are on." I think you might need a doctor." Elena's breath hitched. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. If she called an ambulance, the news would be out before sunrise. The Vance brand would plummet, her enemies would move in for the kill, and the Greenfield deal, her legacy, would be torn apart by vultures. "No," she gasped, reaching out blindly until her hand caught the rough fabric of David's sleeve. She held on to him with a desperation that bypassed all social hierarchy. "No doctors. No one can know. Just ... Help me to the chair, please." David looked at the woman who held his entire future in her hands, now reduced to a trembling figure clinging to a janitor's arm. He could have walked away. He could have let her fall. Instead, he reached down, his large, calloused hand steadying her as he guided her away from the shards of glass and back to the safety of her chair. In that moment, the executioner and the invisible man were gone. There was only a woman in the dark and the man who refused to leave her there. The silence that followed Elena's plea was heavier than the darkness pressing against her eyes. She sat frozen in her ergonomic chair, her fingers digging into the expensive leather arms as she tried to command her brain to make sense of the void. She blinked rapidly, desperate for a spark, a shadow, or even a flicker of the city lights she knew were just beyond the glass. But the world remained a flat, terrifying white expanse. Beside her, she could hear the rhythmic, steady breathing of the man who had identified himself as David. To Elena, David had always been a ghost rustle of trash bags in the hallway, or a faint scent of industrial floor wax that lingered after she left for the night. Now he was the only physical landmark in a universe that had lost its dimensions. "You're still here," she whispered, the statement sounding more like a question. She hated the tremor in her voice. She had spent 20 years eradicating every trace of uncertainty from her tone. Yet here she was, reduced to a frightened child in a designer suit. David didn't answer immediately, and for a heart-stopping second, she feared he had slipped away, leaving her anchored to a desk she couldn't see in a building that suddenly felt like a tomb. Then she heard the soft clink of ceramic against wood. "I'm here, Ms. Vance," David said, his voice low and devoid of the sycophancy she was used to from her subordinates. "I cleared the glass away so you won't step on it. I also found your emergency kit in the desk drawer. There's some aspirin here, though I have a feeling this isn't a headache a couple of pills can fix." He sounded calm, almost dangerously so, which frustrated Elena. She wanted to scream at the unfairness of it, to demand that the world return to its proper order. but the crushing weight in her skull reminded her that she was no longer in control. She reached out tentatively, her hand brushing against a warm mug he had placed near her. The steam carried the sharp, clean scent of peppermint. It was a small human gesture that felt wildly out of place in the cold corporate atmosphere of her office. "Peppermint helps with the nausea," he added. Elena took a sip, the warmth spreading through her chest, momentarily grounding her. She realized with a jolt of panic that the board meeting for the Greenfield acquisition was less than 12 hours away. She couldn't be blind for that. She had to sign the papers. She had to finalize the demolition. If she missed that meeting, or if she showed up unable to see the documents, the vice chairman, a man who had been waiting for her to stumble for a decade, would seize the opportunity to declare her unfit. "I need you to listen to me, David," Elena said, her corporate persona beginning to reassemble itself like a shattered mirror being glued back together. She turned her head toward where she thought he was standing, her sightless eyes wide and searching. "This is a temporary condition. My doctor warned me about ocular strain. It's stress. It will pass by morning, but until it does, no one, absolutely no one, can know about this. If the security team sees me being escorted out like this, or if an ambulance shows up, the news will be on the wire in minutes. My company's stock would drop 10% before the opening bell." David leaned against the edge of the mahogany table, watching the woman who, just hours ago, had felt like a distant, untouchable deity. Up close, without the armor of her piercing gaze, she looked fragile. He thought about the Greenfield factory, about the men like him who were currently working the late shift there, unaware that this woman was planning to pull the rug out from under them. He could tell her right now. He could tell her that he was one of the people she was about to ruin, and that perhaps this blindness was a form of cosmic justice. But as he looked at her trembling hands, he didn't see a CEO. He saw a person drowning in the dark. "I'm not a doctor, Miss Vance, but I've seen enough of the world to know when someone's body is quitting on them," David said, his voice toughening slightly. "You're asking me to help you lie to your company, your board, and probably your own family. Why should I do that?" The question caught Elena off guard. She was used to people doing what she said because she paid them, or because they feared her. She hadn't considered that a janitor might have a moral compass that didn't align with her corporate survival. She took a breath, trying to find a leverage point. "Because I will make it worth your while," she said, falling back on the only language she knew. "I'll double your salary, triple it, whatever it takes for a week of your time. I just need someone to stay here after hours, to read me the sensitive files I can't put through a screen reader, and to make sure I don't walk into it wall when I have to move between my private elevator and this desk. You stay invisible, just like you've always been, but you become my eyes." David felt a bitter taste in his mouth at the phrase, "just like you've always been." It was a reminder that to her, he wasn't a man with a daughter or a history. He was a tool. He looked at the manila folder on her desk, the one labeled Greenfield Project Phase 1. He knew what was in it. If he stayed, if he became her eyes, he would be helping her facilitate the destruction of his own livelihood. But he also knew that if he walked away now, she would eventually be found. The scandal would erupt, and the factory would likely be sold off to an even more ruthless liquidator anyway. More importantly, he needed the money. Lily's next round of tests was coming up, and the copays alone were enough to sink him. This was a deal with the devil, but the devil was offering him a way to save his daughter. "1 week, David said, his voice echoing in the vast, dark office. "I'll help you through the nights. I'll read what you need me to read, and I'll keep your secret. But I don't want a triple salary. I just want your word that you'll actually listen to what I have to say while I'm doing it. You've spent your life looking at numbers, Ms. Vance. For 1 week, you're going to have to listen to the world instead." Elena hesitated. The idea of being forced to listen to a janitor's philosophy was grating, but the alternative was professional suicide. Fine, she snapped, though the bite was gone from her tone. 1 week. Now, start with the folder on the left side of my desk. I need to know the exact wording of the third paragraph on page 12. David walked over and picked up the heavy folder. He opened it, his eyes skimming over the cold, clinical language detailing the termination of industrial operations and the relocation of workforce. He felt a pang of guilt, a sense of betrayal to his friends at the plant. But then, he looked back at Elena. She was leaning forward, her face tight with a mixture of pain and focus, waiting for him to speak. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice steady as he guided the woman who would fire him through the blueprints of his own demise. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the billionaire and the janitor sat in the pool of light from a single desk lamp, one unable to see the world, and the other finally being forced to look at it. The third night of Elena's darkness began not with the cold calculation of a boardroom, but with the sensory intimacy of a world reduced to sound, scent, and touch. By now, the routine had been established with a precision that rivaled Elena's most complex mergers. David would arrive at 8 p.m. His presence announced by the familiar, heavy tread of his work boots and the soft, metallic rattle of his cleaning cart, a sound that had once been background noise to Elena, but had now become her herald of safety. The office, once a theater of power, had transformed into a sensory obstacle course. Elena had learned that the walk from her desk to the private restroom was exactly 22 paces, provided she kept her hand trailed lightly along the edge of the mahogany sideboard. She refused to use a cane, viewing it as a surrender to her condition. So she relied instead on David's voice to navigate the shifting shadows of her own mind. He had become a constant grounding force, a human lighthouse in the white fog of her optic neuritis. Tonight, the air in the office was thick with the scent of rain from the Chicago streets below and the sharp, medicinal temps of the peppermint tea David brewed for her the moment he arrived. "You're late by 4 minutes," Elena remarked as he entered, her voice sharp but lacking its usual lethality. She was sitting perfectly upright, her sightless eyes directed toward the door, a testament to her iron-willed attempt to maintain the illusion of control. David didn't apologize. He simply set the steaming mug on a coaster, ensuring the handle was turned toward her right hand. The elevators were being serviced. "Even the executioner has to wait on mechanical reality sometimes," he replied, his tone carrying a dry wit that Elena found increasingly difficult to punish. He pulled up a guest chair, a chair that cost more than David made in 3 months, and sat across from her. His task for the evening was to read through the environmental impact reports for the Greenfield site, a document filled with the dry technical jargon of soil toxicity and demolition permits. As he read, David found himself translating the cold data into the human reality he knew. When the report mentioned unoccupied structural shells, David thought of the break room where he had shared coffee with men who had worked there for 30 years. When it detailed workforce liquidation schedules, he thought of his neighbor, a father of 4 who had just bought a house. He began to weave these observations into his reading, tentatively at first, then with more conviction. "The report says the ancillary structures are beyond repair," David noted, pausing in his reading. "But that structure is the community center where the plant workers hold their holiday toy drives. If you tear it down for a parking garage, you're not just removing a building. You're removing the only place those kids have to go in the winter." Elena stiffened, her sightless gaze narrowing. "I didn't hire you to provide a social commentary, David. I hired you to read the text. The economics of the Greenfield acquisition don't account for toy drives. They account for a 300% return on investment within 5 years." She expected him to back down, as every junior executive in her firm would have, but David merely turned a page with a slow, deliberate crinkle of paper. "That's the problem with being able to see, Ms. Vance," he said quietly. "You get blinded by the sparkle of the numbers. When you can't see the gloss, you have to listen to the truth of the thing. You're making a graveyard and calling it a development." The silence that followed was brittle. Elena wanted to fire him, to scream at him to leave her office, but she was trapped by her own infirmity. She needed him to navigate the digital encryption of her late-night emails and to verify the desiccators' signatures on the physical contracts that continued to pile up. More than that, she realized with a hollow ache in her chest, she was terrified of the silence that would return if he left. In the dark, David's voice was the only thing that kept the encroaching panic of her helplessness at bay. As the night deepened into the early hours of the morning, the tension began to soften, replaced by a strange, quiet camaraderie born of mutual necessity. Elena found herself asking questions that had nothing to do with the Greenfield project. She asked about the neighborhood he lived in, about the music he liked, and why he stayed in a job that clearly didn't challenge his intellect. David spoke of his daughter, Lily, describing the way she laughed and her obsession with the old jazz records he collected. He spoke of the struggle to keep her healthy, though he carefully omitted the fact that Elena was the one currently threatening her medical insurance. For the first time in years, Elena wasn't the executioner. She was just Elena, a woman sitting in the dark, listening to a stranger tell her about a world she had looked at every day but never truly seen. She realized that David saw people not as assets or liabilities, but as stories. To him, the city wasn't a map of potential profit. It was a living, breathing organism of interconnected lives. "I haven't listened to music in years," Elena admitted, softly, her hand tracing the rim of her tea mug. "I always thought it was a distraction. Silence was my weapon." David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Silence isn't a weapon, ma'am. It's a void. And you've been living in it long before your eyes gave out." He tapped the screen, and the tinny but soulful sound of a saxophone began to fill the vast, empty office. It was a slow, melancholic blues track that seemed to vibrate in the very glass of the windows. Elena closed her eyes, an unnecessary gesture that she found herself doing anyway, and let the music wash over her. Without the distraction of her vision, the notes felt like physical touches, pulling at emotions she had buried under layers of corporate armor. She felt the weight of her loneliness, the staggering cost of her climb to the top, and the terrifying fragility of the empire she had built. For a moment, the Greenfield factory and the Vance Heights development didn't matter. There was only the music, the scent of peppermint, and the steady, quiet presence of the man who had become her guardian. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's called the nearness of you," David replied, watching the moonlight catch the tears that Elena didn't even realize were beginning to track down her cheeks. "I thought you might need to feel like someone was in the room with you." In that moment, the power dynamic of the 80th floor had completely inverted. The billionaire was being led toward a light that had nothing to do with her sight, guided by the very man she had intended to erase. By the fourth night of her blindness, the spatial reality of Elena Vance's world had undergone a profound transformation. The 80th floor was no longer a vast, intimidating monument to her own ego. It had become a sanctuary defined by sound and texture. She had developed a heightened sensitivity to the hum of the building's HVAC system, the distant chime of the elevator, and the specific, rhythmic cadence of David's movements. On this night, a heavy thunderstorm rolled across Lake Michigan, the thunder vibrating through the reinforced glass of her office windows like a low-frequency warning. To Elena, the storm was a symphony of chaos she couldn't see, but she found herself remarkably unperturbed. She was sitting on the velvet sofa in her office, a piece of furniture she had previously viewed as purely decorative, waiting for David to finish organizing the physical files for the morning's preliminary board call. The power of their relationship had shifted into a strange, unspoken partnership. She no longer barked orders. She asked for his perspective, and he gave it with a brutal honesty that her vice presidents would never dare. As he moved around the room, he narrated his actions, giving her a mental map of the space. "I'm putting the Greenfield blueprints in the top right drawer," he said, his voice cutting through the rumble of the thunder. "The red folder is on top. If you run your thumb along the edge, I've put a small piece of tape on the corner so you can identify it by touch." The technical work was exhausting, but it was the interludes of stillness that began to peel back Elena's layers. During a break in the storm, a soft electronic trill echoed through the room. "Sorry," David muttered, reaching for the phone, clipped to his belt. "It's my daughter. I told her I'd check in before her bedtime." Elena tilted her head, a curious softness appearing in her expression. "Let her speak." "I'd like to hear her," she said, surprising even herself with the request. David hesitated, then pressed a button on his screen. A small, bright voice filled the office, a stark contrast to the sterile environment. "Hi, Daddy. I drew a picture of the factory today. It has big smoke clouds, but I made them pink because they look like cotton candy. Are you coming home soon? I want to sing you the song." David's face, which Elena could not see but could hear softening in his tone, broke into a smile. "Not yet, Lilybug. I'm helping a friend finish some important work. Go ahead and send me the song, okay? I'll listen to it before I leave." A moment later, a voice note arrived. It was the same melody David had played for Elena the night before Levi and Rose, but sung with the shaky, earnest enthusiasm of a 7-year-old. Lily's voice was thin and slightly breathless, a telltale sign of the heart condition David had mentioned. But it was filled with an unshakable joy. Elena sat in silence as the recording ended. The song, which she had always associated with grainy French films and expensive dinners, suddenly sounded like the most important piece of music ever written. It wasn't about romance. It was about a child's hope and a father's devotion. "She's beautiful," Elena whispered, her sightless eyes shimmering with a sudden, sharp clarity of emotion. "She sounds like she has so much light in her." David leaned against the desk, looking at the woman who sat in the shadows. He felt a lump in his throat as he realized that for all her wealth, Elena was starving for the kind of connection he had with Lily. "She is the light," David said quietly. "Everything I do, every floor I buff, every hour I spend reading your files in the dark, it's all for her. She doesn't know that the world can be a cold place. She just thinks that if you sing loud enough, the shadows go away." Elena reached out, her hand finding the rough cotton of David's sleeve. She didn't pull away this time. She held on, seeking the warmth of another human being. "I've spent my life building walls to keep the shadows out," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I think I just ended up building a dark room for myself." The intimacy of the moment was interrupted by the harsh, insistent buzz of Elena's desk phone. It was an internal line, one she couldn't ignore. David guided her hand to the receiver. It was Marcus, the vice chairman, his voice dripping with forced concern. "Elena, you haven't answered my emails in 3 days. The board is getting restless about the Greenfield signing tomorrow. We need you at the site at 10 a.m. for the press conference and the final signature. Are you still coming, or should I take the lead?" Elena's grip on the phone tightened. She looked toward David, though she saw only white. He stayed silent, but his presence was a grounding weight. "I'll be there, Marcus," she said, her voice regaining its executioner edge, though it felt like a mask she was forcing on. "I'm just finishing some final due diligence. Don't get too comfortable in my seat." She hung up and slumped back into the sofa, the weight of the coming morning crashing down on her. The Greenfield Factor Writhe place David had described as a community, the place where Lily's pink clouds were drawn, was scheduled to be erased by her hand in less than 12 hours. "David," she said, her voice barely audible over the return of the rain. "If I do this, if I sign those papers tomorrow, Am I the person you think I am? It was a plea for absolution, a desperate attempt to find a middle ground between her corporate duty and the humanity she had rediscovered in the dark. David looked at the woman who had become his unlikely companion. He knew that the paper she was referring to would end his insurance and throw his neighborhood into chaos. He could have lied to her, or he could have lashed out. Instead, he chose the truth. "I think you're a woman who has forgotten how to look at the faces behind the numbers," he said. "But you're also the woman who listened to my daughter sing. You have two sets of eyes now, Elena. The ones that see profit and the ones I've been trying to give you this week. Tomorrow, you have to decide which ones you're going to use." As the night bled into the early hours of the morning, they sat together in the silence of the 80th floor, the billionaire and the janitor, both waiting for the light to return, though neither was sure what it would reveal. The return of the light was not a gentle, gradual awakening, but a violent, silent explosion of color that jolted Elena Vance from a restless sleep. She had dozed off on the velvet sofa in her office shortly before dawn, the echo of the thunderstorm still rumbling in her chest. When she opened her eyes, she instinctively braced herself for the suffocating, milky white fog that had imprisoned her for the last 7 days. Instead, her retinas were flooded with the piercing golden brilliance of the morning sun reflecting off the waters of Lake Michigan. The Chicago skyline stood before her in agonizingly sharp detail, a towering forest of steel, glass, and concrete. The stress-induced inflammation in her optic nerves had finally subsided, just as her specialist had predicted. For a long, breathless moment, Elena did nothing but stare at the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Tears of profound, overwhelming relief spilling over her lashes and cutting hot trails down her cheeks. The nightmare was over. She was no longer a helpless prisoner in her own empire. She stood up, her legs a little unsteady, and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing her palms against the cool glass. The city was hers again. But as the initial euphoria began to ebb, it left behind a strange, hollow ache in the center of her chest. The world was visible once more, but the vast, silent office felt unbearably empty without the steady, gravelly voice that had anchored her through the dark. The scent of wild peppermint still clung faintly to the air. A ghost of the night before. A reminder of the man who had taught her how to navigate the shadows. It took Elena an hour to wash away the physical evidence of her vulnerability in the executive suite's private washroom. She stood before the brightly lit vanity mirror, methodically reconstructing the executioner in cashmere. She applied her makeup with surgical precision, masking the exhaustion beneath her eyes, and slipped into a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit that felt more like a coat of armor than a piece of clothing. Yet, as she looked at her reflection, a profound sense of dissonance washed over her. The woman staring back was the billionaire CEO who dismantled companies for sport, the apex predator of the corporate food chain. But the mind behind those eyes had spent the last week listening to the soulful wail of an old saxophone, learning the layout of a factory floor through the stories of a janitor, and feeling the innocent, hopeful weight of a 7-year-old girl's voice note. Elena closed her eyes, trying to banish the image of Lily's pink cotton candy clouds from her thoughts. She had a job to do. The boardroom was waiting. At exactly 9:45 a.m., Elena stepped out of her private suite and into the bustling reality of the 80th floor. The contrast was physically jarring. For a week, this floor had been a sanctuary of quiet intimacy, populated only by her and her unseen guardian. Now, it was a cacophony of ringing phones, clicking heels, and the sycophantic chatter of junior executives. As she walked down the hall, people scrambled out of her way, their eyes lowered in deference. They saw the Iron Queen restored to her, thrown completely unaware that a few hours prior, she had been clinging to a janitor's sleeve just to walk across the room. When Elena entered the glass-walled boardroom, the atmosphere instantly shifted, growing taut and frigid. The massive, polished oak table was surrounded by the board of directors, their faces a collective mask of calculated ambition. At the far end sat Marcus, the vice chairman, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Smelled of expensive, aggressive cologne, a sharp contrast to the honest, grounding scent of sweat and floor wax that had defined Elena's nights. Centered precisely on the table in front of her leather chair was a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The Greenfield factory acquisition and liquidation. The execution orders. Elena took her seat slowly, her newly restored vision locking onto the documents. Before her blindness, this folder would have represented nothing more than a strategic victory, a thrilling maximization of shareholder value. Now, the stark black ink seemed to pulse with human cost. As Marcus began his opening remarks, droning on about asset reallocation, workforce redundancies, and demolition timetables, Elena felt a wave of nausea. The corporate jargon, designed to sanitize the destruction of livelihoods, sounded grotesque to her newly awakened ears. She wasn't just liquidating an asset. She was leveling a community center. She was firing the men who brought each other coffee. She was tearing up the medical insurance that kept a little girl's heart beating. Elena. Marcus's voice cut through the heavy silence, pulling her back to the present. He pushed a heavy silver Mont Blanc fountain pen across the polished wood. It stopped mere inches from her hand. The press is waiting downstairs for the announcement. All we need is your signature on page 42, and the Greenfield property is officially ours to raise. The entire room was watching her. The silence was deafening, a vacuum of anticipation waiting for the executioner to strike the final blow. Elena reached out, her fingers closing around the cold metal barrel of the pen. It felt unspeakably heavy, as if it contained the gravity of 300 families. She uncapped it, the quiet click echoing off the glass walls. She pulled the document toward her, staring down at the dotted line beneath her printed name. She pressed the nib to the paper, a single drop of black ink blooming onto the stark white page. She took a deep breath, preparing to compartmentalize. Her soul preparing to bury the woman she had been in the dark. But as she inhaled, the high-powered ventilation system pushed a current of air through the boardroom, carrying an anomaly that hit Elena's heightened senses like a physical blow. Peppermint. Wild, sharp, medicinal. Elena froze. The pen hovered a millimeter above the paper. Her heart slammed against her ribs in a sudden, erratic rhythm. She slowly lifted her head, looking past Marcus, past the expectant faces of the board members, and out through the soundproof glass walls of the boardroom into the sprawling outer hallway. A man in a faded blue industrial jumpsuit was moving methodically along the corridor, emptying the heavy executive recycling bins onto a rolling gray cart. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace, his shoulders slightly hunched against the weight of the world. And then, watching his lips move, Elena's mind filled in the sound that the soundproof glass blocked out. He was humming. The cadence, the sway of his shoulder sight was the unmistakable rhythm of La Vie en Rose. The man turned slightly to retrieve a crumpled piece of paper that had fallen to the marble floor. As he straightened up, the morning light, pouring in from the atrium, caught the stark white plastic of the Namatag pinned to his chest. David. All the air left Elena's lungs in a single, agonizing rush. The man who had saved her sanity. The man who had taught her how to see. The father fighting for the little girl with the pink clouds was the very man whose life she was holding at the tip of her pen. The Mont Blanc slipped from Elena's trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the oak table, as the reality of what she was about to do shattered the last remnants of the Iron Queen. The clatter of the silver Mont Blanc pen against the polished oak table sounded like a gunshot in the sterile quiet of the boardroom. It rolled in a lazy arc, leaving a tiny, jagged smear of black ink across the signature line of the Greenfield liquidation contract before coming to a rest against Marcus's coffee cup. For several agonizing seconds, no one moved. The board of directors, a collection of the city's most ruthless financial minds, stared at their CEO in absolute bewilderment. Elena Vance, the Iron Queen, the executioner in Kashmir, had never hesitated in her life, let alone dropped a pen at the climax of a multi-million-dollar acquisition. But Elena wasn't looking at the contract, or the spilled ink, or the confused faces of her colleagues. Her newly restored vision was locked entirely on the figure moving through the outer hallway beyond the soundproof glass. David, he was just a few dozen feet away, tossing discarded financial reports into a gray canvas bin, moving with the same heavy, rhythmic cadence that had paced her office in the dark. Through the thick glass, she couldn't hear the melody, but the sway of his shoulders and the movement of his lips were unmistakable. He was humming La Vie en Rose, the scent of wild peppermint, drawn into the room by the HVAC system, lingered in her nostrils like a physical tether connecting the cold reality of her corporate empire to the profound vulnerability of her lost week. Her mind raced, colliding the two versions of the universe she now inhabited. The spreadsheets that demanded the destruction of the Greenfield factory, and the gravelly voice that had told her about a little girl named Lily who drew pink cotton candy clouds. The eyes that had guided her through the most terrifying darkness of her life belonged to a man she had been actively plotting to destroy. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful, a sharp ache expanding in her chest that had nothing to do with her optic nerves and everything to do with her soul. Elena, Marcus's voice broke the spell, his tone laced with a dangerous mixture of concern and condescension. He reached across the table, picking up the Mont Blanc and holding it out to her like a teacher prompting a distracted child. "Did you slip? The press is waiting in the lobby. We are on a very tight schedule here. Just sign the document, and we can move on to the restructuring phase." Elena slowly dragged her gaze away from the glass and looked at the vice chairman. For the first time in a decade, she truly saw him not as a rival or an asset, but as a hollow man, a vessel of endless, unfeeling consumption. She looked down at the thick leather portfolio, the pages filled with sanitized language that translated to broken homes, severed lifelines, and a father forced to choose between groceries and his daughter's heart medication. "I didn't slip, Marcus," Elena said, her voice starting low but gathering a terrifying, resonant strength. She did not take the pen. Instead, she placed both hands flat on the oak table and stood up. The leather of her chair creaked loudly in the silent room. "I'm not signing it." A collective gasp rippled through the board members. Marcus's forced smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of disbelief. "What are you talking about? You've spent 2 years setting up the Greenfield demolition. It's the cornerstone of our third-quarter projections. You can't just back out. If you're having some kind of episode, T." He let the threat hang in the air, a clear reference to her unexplained absence and strange behavior over the past week. Elena leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a predatory intensity that made Marcus instinctively press back into his seat. "The Greenfield demolition is canceled, effectively immediately. We are not leveling that factory, and we are not building luxury condominiums. We are going to restructure the plant, update the machinery, and invest in the community infrastructure." She reached down, picked up the liquidation contract, and calmly tore the thick stack of papers in half, dropping the pieces onto the polished wood. "If any of you have a problem with a long-term investment strategy that doesn't rely on gutting the working class, you can leave your resignations with my assistant. This meeting is over," without waiting for a response from the stunned executives. Elena turned on her heel and walked toward the glass doors. She pushed them open, stepping out of the refrigerated air of the boardroom and into the warmer, bustling atmosphere of the hallway. The sudden sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor caused David to stop his work. He turned around, instinctively dropping his gaze and adopting the invisible posture of the night crew, ready to press himself against the wall to let the CEO pass. "Morning, Ms. Vance." he murmured politely, keeping his eyes fixed on the hem of her charcoal gray skirt. But she didn't walk past him. The clicking of her heels stopped right in front of his cart. David frowned, slowly raising his head. He looked at her perfectly tailored suit, her immaculate makeup, and finally, her eyes. They were a piercing, unclouded hazel, and they were looking directly at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Then he noticed the faint, lingering scent of expensive perfume, the same perfume that mingled with the smell of old paper and peppermint tea in the dark office on the 80th floor. He looked past her shoulder, through the open doors of the boardroom, seeing the shredded contract on the table and the bewildered faces of the city's most powerful executives staring at them. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in David's mind. The blood drained from his face as he took a step back, his hand gripping the edge of his cleaning cart so hard his knuckles turned white. "You, .. he whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. "You were the woman in the office. The whole time. You're the CEO." He felt a sickening plunge in his stomach. He had spent a week pouring his heart out, criticizing the company and inadvertently begging for his own livelihood to the very woman who had orchestrated its demise. He had been comforting the executioner. Elena didn't flinch at the accusation in his voice. She stood her ground, the formidable armor of her corporate persona completely dissolving in the bright light of the hallway. She said softly, her voice trembling with an emotion the board of directors had never witnessed. "I was the woman who was blind. And I was the woman who was going to fire you today." David closed his eyes, expecting the worst, preparing himself for the cold dismissal that would end his ability to care for Lily. But when he opened them, Elena was holding out her hand to him, not in a demand, but in a gesture of profound gratitude and surrender. "But I didn't sign the papers, David, because of you. You spent a week teaching me how to listen to the world instead of just extracting from it. You gave me a second set of eyes, and I promise you I intend to use them." David stared at her hand, the magnitude of what she was saying slowly washing over him. The factory was safe. His neighborhood was safe. Lily's insurance was safe. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for years, reaching out to take her hand. His calloused grip met hers, a silent pact forged between the penthouse and the pavement. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice thick with relief. Elena smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that transformed her face entirely. "Now," she said, "we rebuild. I need a new director of community integration for the Greenfield Revitalization Project. Someone who knows the floor, who knows the people, and who understands that a factory isn't just a building, it's a heartbeat." She paused, her eyes softening as she recalled the tinny voice note from the thunderstorm. "And after we sort out your new office, ... I'd very much like to meet the girl who draws the pink cotton candy clouds." That afternoon, the executioner in Kashmir officially died, and in her place, a new visionary emerged, one who knew that true power didn't lie in how much you could tear down, but in how much light you could bring into the dark. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Drew's Daily Stories for more tales of redemption and hidden heroes. Comment below. Have you ever felt invisible in your job? Let's talk about it.